Good morning from Los Angeles and good evening from South Africa. We're here with Beth Karas, former New York prosecutor and TV journalist. Good morning, Beth.
Good morning. Good afternoon for me in New York.
That's right. Yeah, we're all over the place here. And we're going to talk about JonBenet today. So you've been covering this case for a long time. Just recently, you were asked to speak for a documentary.
Yes, I was asked to be the legal analyst and one of many people interviewed by the production company. Actually, it was a collaboration on production company. They did the three-part series for Investigation Discovery. It first aired on September 12th, 13th, and 14th, but it has since re-aired. So I wasn't actually on the ground reporting on the case when it first happened. I had joined truTV only a couple of years earlier. Another reporter, a West Coast-based reporter, was in Boulder. But I did have a portion of the story, a slice of it, when John Mark Carr surfaced years later. And of course, I always followed it, did occasional reports from the home base on the trial. However, as a legal analyst, I was, giving, analysis on, the grand jury, the investigation, why certain steps were taken, different suspects, and what happened with the different suspects. They used me for that as well, the intruder theory suspects.
Got it.
Okay, so we that's one thing we want to really ask you about. We'll get to that. We want to sort of go through which suspects you felt were more maybe credible, right? Because that's definitely part of the narrative you came into in the documentary, where you sort of looked at Lou Smith and you looked at the various intruder scenarios. So we're going to get to that. But before we do, well, first of all, it's just great talking to you. I mean, funnily enough, you were on TV last night, like here in South Africa. There was a special on JonBenet. It was like so odd seeing you. You really look great on TV, and you really had a great role in that documentary. I thought it was awesome.
That aired last night in South Africa, the Discovery series?
Yeah. So it was part one of two. I think in some cases there's 3 parts, but this was around about an hour, I think. Yeah.
Great.
So for those who haven't seen Beth in that documentary, what's interesting is you have Diane's Diamond, who's sort of a journalist covering the whole thing. And what's really interesting was how you have a journalist sort of covering one side of it, and Beth, you sort of came in, certainly in the first episode, you came in maybe after the first third or so, and you really sort of told the story from the sort of perspective of Lou Smith in a way, and the intruder side of things. And I must say, as the documentary goes on, your voice comes through more and more and more, So let's just go into that, the sort of legal side of things. Let me just start with, what do you think of the Boulder District Attorney, Alex Hunter?
Well, it is a fact that the district attorney's office was not working well with the Boulder Police Department, right? Now, police and prosecutors generally work together. The police put together a case, they investigate, they bring it to the DA's office to prosecute.
Yeah.
DA's offices will be involved in investigations too. It's not always that they get a case once an arrest is made. They came from different perspectives. The police wanted to rule out the Ramseys. They wanted their complete cooperation so they could do what they do in all sorts of investigations, is move out in concentric circles. You need to deal with the people who had the most contact with this dead child and rule them out, and then keep moving out to the, to what became the intruder theory, total, complete strangers. So the police never could rule out the Ramseys because they never got complete cooperation, contrary to what their lawyers have said over the years. The Boulder DA seemed like, he, Alex Hunter, was taking the intruder theory path almost immediately. Although insiders have been quoted, and I take this from books I've read, written, for example, by the former lead detective Steve Thomas, that there was a time when he's like, yeah, I think the Ramseys were involved somehow, like he believed it, but he wasn't saying that publicly. He brought in a homicide investigator, retired homicide investigator from another part of Colorado, to work with his office, Lou Smith, And Lou Smith always believed the intruder theory. So you did not have Alex Hunter's office working well with the police. So what do I think of Alex Hunter? Well, you want to talk about the grand jury? I mean, he did put the case in the grand jury, and people expected there'd be an indictment returned, a true bill indictment by the grand jury. And we only learned in 2013 that that happened when a judge unsealed the records, and that the grand jury voted to charge John and Patsy Ramsey not with murder, but with charges like child abuse resulting in death, endangering a child.
Just to backtrack a little before we go down that road, you're a former assistant district attorney. Now, if you look at let's say what the average track record is of a district attorney and a district attorney's office. Don't you think it's a little bit strange that Alex Hunter never, Lisa will know, I think it's in the 10 years preceding the John Bonet case, he'd actually not brought a single case to trial, not just murder case, just any case. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, that's right. His office did not try a lot of cases, and certainly not a lot of murder cases, but it's a community where a lot of murders did not happen. Mm-hmm. However, they plan out a lot of cases. And that is the case in most jurisdictions also. I mean, 95% or so of cases end up in a plea deal because most people are arrested and there's good evidence against them. I mean, they're guilty. Not all. And the cases that go to trial are somebody's professing their innocence or there's a problem with the evidence and it goes to trial. But the vast majority of cases plead out across the country. But Alex Hunter's office, well, it was a small office, but it was, I was shocked actually as I read and learned about his office, how much they reduced charges or dismissed cases or just didn't seem to want to go to trial. You got to take a tough case to trial. Sometimes you just have to do it and let the jurors decide because it's the right thing to do. Yeah. And he's
Isn't it true, when you have such media interest and such community interest, people want it resolved. People need a sense of resolution and to not let it go that route. Mm-hmm.
That is true. That high-profile case puts added pressure on the police and the prosecution to solve it. And sometimes in rushing to do that, they may make mistakes, maybe intentionally do something wrong. It happens. We see wrongful convictions, unfortunately, but not always. O.J. Simpson, they say, was a rush to judgment. A lot of people beg to differ, but, he became a free man for 13 years. So I do think there is pressure. There is added pressure, but district attorneys are generally elected, not everywhere. In some states they're appointed, but generally they're an elected politician who is supposed to keep his or her eye on the ball of justice and do what is right and take whatever time is needed to do what's right. And if what's right is dismissing a case, that's what you should do too. So I do think he had that added pressure, but he certainly wasn't rushing. In fact, according to the police, he was creating obstacles for the police. He wasn't letting the police do typical early on in the investigation steps like getting the cell phone records of the family and their credit card statements. That was shocking that Alex Hunter would never authorize that.
So there's a couple of things that I want to ask then. I do want to know if you feel like the right decision was made by Alex Hunter in not trying the case. What would you have done had it been your case? And so let's do that first, and then I want to talk about Lou Smith.
I don't know. I mean, none of us knows everything that the police and prosecution knows. I don't think we are privy to everything. I've never seen the police reports, and not in-house. So I don't know what I would have done differently. Well, a couple of things. I guess there are a few things I would have done differently initially. The parents would have been separated and questioned immediately, and they weren't. And within hours, they each have lawyers. They've got a PR team in place. You don't talk to the police until the following April. They go on television together and talk to CNN 5 days after the murder in a controlled environment, in a controlled interview to get the message they wanted out. Mark Klass, I have read, whose daughter Polly Klass was kidnapped and murdered right from her home in a pajama party she's having with girlfriends when she was about 13,
Yeah.
begged them to cooperate with the police.
Yeah.
Why, please act like parents who have had their daughters, senselessly, brutally murdered in their home.
Whites did as well.
Yeah.
Pardon me?
The whites also were like, please,
Yeah.
just
Flee
cooperate with the
yourself.
police. And the whites didn't like this was their best friend. They didn't like the instant lawyering up, the instant taking the media into their confidence and not the police. But just another thing, Beth, I don't know what the normal sort of procedure would be, but something like a lie detector test, a polygraph. But after 3 years, yeah.
You can't force someone to take a polygraph. They have to agree to it. They have to consent to it, and it's inadmissible. It's a good investigative tool, though, but it's not admissible.
Yeah. I mean,
If you take the fact that after 3 years, the media was sort of saying, well, would you take one? And they were like, yeah, we've just never been asked. But the thing being, in a case like this, when the lie detector thing comes up, when should it have come up? I mean, in a case that drags on,
Earlier is probably better, but I seem to recall that the police did ask them, and they said they would do it, and then when they tried to move forward on it, they said no, but then later said they were never asked. So I'm not so sure that it's true that they were never asked. It said yes.
No,
And they said,
well, they were interviewed on CNN around the time they were publicizing their book Death of Innocence, March 2000, and they were first on, I think, Barbara Walters, and then they said, yeah, we'll give a polygraph, and then Larry King was next in the whole PR blitz, and then the first question Larry asked was, well, let's just deal with something current. Would you be prepared to do a polygraph? And then they said, well, sure, we've just never been asked. And then they said, well, the police heard your interview and they say, we'll set it up. Will you do it? And then it's a very, very long narrative, just the polygraph narrative, because they set a lot of conditions in the same way they set conditions for the police interviews, the same thing. But I just wondered from your side, what would be normal in a case like that? At what stage would you say, well, let's do the polygraph? Where do you slot that?
I don't think the polygraph is all that important, but earlier is better, I suppose. However, there's a reason why they're not admissible, because they don't always give true reading. So if the reading is they're being deceptive, it actually could be a false reading, even if they're telling the truth. Likewise, it could be they're not being deceptive, but they're actually lying. So there are issues. Although I understand polygraphs are better today than that they have been in the past, but earlier is better in any investigation like that. So you want to the crime scene was contaminated. It wasn't properly secured. The police officer was left alone with the family while some of the detectives stepped out. Never should have let John Ramsey with his friend Fleet White go and search the house, and that's when Jean-Benet was found. And she's brought upstairs by her father. There's a crime scene down there. So the whole place was contaminated, and her body is covered with a blanket, further contaminating her.
Yeah.
What's crazy is, if you just think of it, you have, Lisa, I'll let you jump in after this. If you just take that little piece of the narrative, you actually have John going downstairs, finding Jean-Benet under a blanket, bringing her upstairs, and then putting her under a blanket again. It's just a funny inversion in a way of what was there. Now, if you're going to speculate and say maybe he was involved in some way in the crime, maybe, whatever, then you have the same thing the other way again, going downstairs, covering in a blanket, going back upstairs. I'm just saying it from a narrative perspective, it's interesting.
Right. Now, it's important to point out that Mary Lacey, when she was DA in 2008, wrote John Ramsey a letter and said, sorry you were ever considered a suspect, and the family had nothing to do with this. Patsy had passed away by then, 2 years earlier, but an expert who was on the investigation discovery theory said that it's a mistake to rule anyone out based upon DNA evidence in the case. So, everyone, until somebody is arrested, everyone is potentially a suspect.
Especially inconclusive DNA evidence. I mean, it was that DNA evidence was never solid. It never pointed to one particular person. I mean, there was quite a bit of it. So,
Well, it was much of a comparison too. It was like just a few marks.
Yeah, exactly. So I want to talk about Lou Smith. So, Lou Smith was hired by Alex Hunter. And, I think the what's really valuable about your experience is that, we can talk about what seems unusual or unsettling to us, but certainly you can speak about what's typical based on your own experience. So, with Lou Smith, I mean, he came in and he really, I mean, almost from the get-go was really heavy into the intruder did it theory. And so I'm wondering if, to what extent does a district attorney say to somebody that they've hired, an investigator, this is what I would like you to look at, kind of point them in a certain direction and then let them do their thing. Is that typical? Do you think that may have happened here with Alex and Lou?
Well, I mean, every case is individual, but I'm sure that, I want to believe that Alex Hunter said, I just want you to take an independent look. You're more experienced than the Boulder police because you've handled so many homicides in longer years than any of them had practiced or been an officer. And I don't know if he steered him. You shouldn't steer him, but I suppose he could have said, "Look, why don't you take a look at the intruder theory? Let's rule it out." Maybe he said that, and Lou Smith came back to him and said, "I can't rule it out. In fact, I think that's what happened." So,
But have you seen that happen where a DA pushes, not pushes, but suggests that you look at this more so than that? Is that typical?
Well, no, I can't say it's typical, but there are people who believe that Alex Hunter and Lou Smith were just focused on the intruder theory and were protecting the Ramseys. I don't know that that's really true, but for those of us on the outside, that's what it looks like.
Yeah.
It is true, though, that Alex Hunter, at least he didn't seem to have confidence in the Boulder police. But Steve Thomas wrote a book. He was only on the investigation 18 months. He was disgusted by the direction of it and the way he felt Alex Hunter was putting on roadblocks. He wrote a book about it. He certainly seemed to know what he was doing, at least based on my experience in reading his book.
Steve Thomas did. Yeah. Okay.
Well, if you look at the guys who kind of followed in Lou Smith's footsteps, Ollie Gray and John, I'm not sure how to say his name, San Augustine, those guys.
Yeah.
They all stuck very much to that intruder narrative. Now, before we sort of deal with the merits of that, obviously, did the intruder sort of bring nothing? He didn't bring a notepad, he didn't bring a pen, he didn't bring... all the things the intruder left behind were the Ramsey stuff. But something I just want to throw a little bit of a span into the works there. What we noticed, because to me, Lou Smith seems like a nice guy, seems like a solid guy, genuine guy, great investigator, great track record. But, Lisa and I were also thinking, well, if Alex Hunter wants to hire someone who is going to go down a road that maybe Alex Hunter wants him to go on, he's going to want to go down that road anyway, isn't he going to choose someone with certain characteristics? And we just wondered whether Christianity or the faith of the Ramseys played into the faith of Lou Smith and because the same thing seems to apply with Ollie Gray and this other guy. St. Augustine, one thing he mentioned, just quickly in that investigation discovery thing, he said something like, the idea that two God-fearing people, blah, blah, blah. And it was like, so you're obviously thinking that's where he's coming from.
Well, it's an interesting point you raise, and I don't know that any of us will ever know the answer. If these outside investigators were brought in and selected in part because they were very Christian, like the Ramseys, that all that they are, supports, I suppose, those who think they were targeted because of that, at least in part. But there's no question that Lou Smith had a very good reputation and had handled a lot of homicides. And from Alex Hunter's point of view, Hunter felt the Boulder police were zeroing in on the Ramseys. He wanted them to be broader, so Lou Smith was going to give him that. And then it turned out to be two almost like warring factions because, truthfully, the Ramseys could never be, or at least early on in the investigation, they were not ruled out because the police could never get information to satisfy themselves that the parents had nothing to do.
Lou Smith would even in his own documentaries where Lou Smith was sort of the star, he would talk about starting his day. Every day he'd start the day, sort of park near the Ramsey's home and he'd say a prayer, and that would be the first thing he would do. And I just wonder whether, if you have these deep beliefs, and Lou Smith died shortly after that. He died in, not that long after, 2010, I think it was. But, his wife was also ill, and I think your strength, your faith only gets stronger then, and if your suspects are really strong Christians, which the Ramseys both were, I think, doesn't that change your faith?
I think you could argue that it does, that it might color his thinking, that these very Christian people, God-fearing folks, would never do something like this to their daughter, would never cover up an accidental death and stage it to look like a murder and write a ransom note or do it intentionally. It's pretty horrific, the way she was found. And, if you were to say, oh, the parents did it, I mean, it's pretty involved what they did with the garrote and everything. Yeah. So,
but I find it, I do find it, for me personally, when I hear an investigator like instantly brush aside something and saying like, oh, a parent would never do that or a Christian would never do that. I mean, as well as us, you spend any amount of time in crime, every person out there does all sorts of crazy stuff. And so I think that for me just kind of loses credibility. I don't think that that's somebody who's really looking at something objectively. Somebody else that was troubling for us was Linda Arndt. I mean, certainly she was put into a very bad situation in the beginning of the case and really messed up what was happening at that crime scene. But then some things that we found out after the fact, Steve Thomas talks about this in his book, and some other people do too, is that, Linda seems to kind of go back and forth a little bit. Initially she gave an interview where she was very hard on John Ramsey. I mean, it was a very odd interview where she comes straight out and basically like talks about facing him and being almost like terrified of him. And he talks about that on Dr. Phil, his reaction to that. But then several years later, there was this information about her meeting with Patsy individually and privately, and she would not tell anybody what they talked about. And she seemed to have a real close connection with her.
Hugging Burke and hugging Patsy, and just very personal contact.
Sending them flowers, stuff like that. And so it's like, in a case, like, regardless of how you feel, and I'm not saying that, everybody's a human being, right? And you're going to have certain feelings. Ultimately, these parents, regardless of what you think about them, they lost a child. And so there are sensitivities there, and I understand that. But I just feel like that's such a conflict of interest for anybody who's investigating a case to be having those relationships. Do you agree?
Yeah, particularly because it was an open case,
yeah.
Right? And the Boulder Police Department, at least many in the Boulder PD, did not rule out the Ramseys. So it was unusual. And she's the one who let John Ramsey and his friend search the house. She was there alone, and maybe it was a little overwhelming for her, and she thought, well, this is a kidnapping. We just want to make sure she's not in the house. Not for a million years thinking that this is going to end up being a murder.
Yeah.
What's interesting, Beth, in your documentary, Whitson was the officer in charge of that crime scene. Yeah. And he actually said, it was my crime scene was my responsibility, and then I left it in Linda Arndt's hands. And when there's also wonder, not much is going on with in Boulder. There are not a lot of crimes going on, and yet Whitson then abandons the only crime that's going on then, and they sort of go back to Boulder PD, and then they leave Linda Arndt there. He leaves someone in charge who he knows has no experience in any of this.
Well, true, but if I recall, Nick, it's the morning after Christmas Day, and there were there were a lot of officers who were off that day, so they were kind of working on with a small staff.
Yeah. Well, and
But I just wonder,
inexperienced staff.
why would you leave Linda Arendt, of all people, of all those officers, why would you leave her in charge? And it's not just that, it's also, you know, when Officer French arrived on the scene and all these other officers as well, a lot of them were saying already, they were saying, something doesn't seem right, there were no footprints in the snow, that's another story as well. But I'm just saying, of all the candidates you could have chosen, because there were a bunch of officers on the scene, there were also a bunch of neighbors milling around then already, and surely Whitson must have been able to say, well, things are getting a bit out of hand, let's leave a trooper in charge, and not the, I think maybe potentially the least qualified person.
I think that I suspect that in hindsight, he probably regrets that and wishes he had secured the house and said, everybody, you know, stay where you are or step out or go to the neighbors, and, you know, and then just sort of roping off the house as a crime scene so that nobody could do anything in there. I'm sure he regrets all that, but
well,
at
you know,
the time, it
yeah.
was a kid.
Sorry, you know what's interesting to me though is that the ransom note, which I want to talk about with you, sets it up that there's going to be a phone call. So people had to be inside the house to get that phone call, which is
Right, by 10 o'clock.
you know. So
Another thing, just to add to that, the coroner only arrives there like at 8 o'clock that night, really late, and he is there for 10 minutes, and then he is back again. And another thing which to me just seems a bit odd, I'm not an expert pathologist, but Lisa and I have looked at the skull injury, you can actually see in some of the documentary footage, you can see the bruising to the brain, you can see this extensive trauma to John Bonet's brain. So it's not just a little section, it's a long band. It's almost like an abyss of tissue that's been ruptured. Now, is a coroner really going to say, wow, this person died of asphyxia when you've had such incredible, obvious brain trauma? I mean,
You can't say it on the scene. They have to do an autopsy to determine it.
Yeah.
So that's
in his report,
but don't forget where she's found is not where she was killed. I mean, where the coroner saw her is not where she was killed. So I can't really explain why the coroner was only there for 10 minutes. I have seen that in other cases where they're basically just there to oversee the collection of the body, or sometimes they just send one of their investigators, a medical legal investigator, a death investigator. So, and sometimes they're there for longer times, you know, collecting evidence. So it's really, you know, it varies.
Yeah.
Maybe they should have been here longer, but don't forget, I mean, where she is underneath the tree in the living room is not where she was originally found by her father.
in this case for you, go ahead, Nick. I'm sorry.
Lisa, just touch on something quickly. I don't know whether it's a case that the coroner is inexperienced, or whether the coroner is, and maybe you could give some information here, where, you know, do the coroners work a lot with the district attorney, you know, because I'm just saying, what I'm trying to suggest here is a possible thing where if you never want cases tried in a courtroom, if you always just want to settle, then if you muddy the evidence at the pathology level, then it's muddied at that point already. We found another case, I'm not sure if you're aware of this, we found another case that happened, I think, a year earlier, where a very, very overweight woman was bludgeoned by her boyfriend, well, allegedly. And again, they said there must be an intruder. There was no evidence of an intruder. But the coroner, same coroner, Mayer, basically said the cause of death wasn't the bludgeoning. The cause of death was, well, she would have died of
Obesity.
She would have died of obesity eventually.
Yeah.
And again, it was like, can't you know?
I don't know. So I guess really what he's getting at is, I mean, do political factors come into play with coroners?
Coroner, actually, they're coroners in some states. In the states they call them medical examiners. It's the forensic pathologist, medical doctor, and MD. They're an independent arm. They're not an arm of the district attorney or the police. They're an independent arm, and they will investigate suspicious deaths, at home, unattended deaths. They give two opinions: the cause of death and the manner of death. Manner of death is suicide, accident, homicide, death at the hands of another, natural cause, or undetermined. Sometimes they can't tell if a person cleaning is gone, meant to shoot himself, or it was an accident. You know,
Yeah.
staged the suicide to look like it was an accident to spare the family. Stuff like that happens. All right, so that's manner of death. Cause of death is what actually caused it. Blunt force trauma, strangulation, whatever, knifing, gunshots. So they are an independent arm, but they are influenced by an investigation when it is a crime, because they'll find out from the police, you know, what happened,
Yeah.
and or at least, you know, what the police found. Sometimes you can't tell if you're just looking at a body on the autopsy table what it is. You can tell the cause, but you can't tell, you know, what it was. When you hear the circumstances, I mean, a gunshot to the back of somebody's head obviously is a homicide and not a suicide. But they need the police reports to help them understand how this person died.
Yeah.
So have you seen, have either of you seen the series The Night Of?
Yes.
I haven't seen it
Do you
yet.
remember, Beth? Do you remember, Beth, that scene where the prosecutor goes to the pathologist?
Yes, I do. That doesn't happen. That's a terrible scene where the prosecutor gets him to give her the answer she wants him to say on the stand in order to get this kid.
Yeah.
I mean, he still he says what she wants to hear, and then she kind of goes like that, and then he does it again in a more convincing way, and then later that's exactly what he says in court.
Actually, let me take that back. It does happen. I sat in a courtroom once where I thought that something like that, some shenanigans was going on, but I don't want to believe that police and prosecutors engage in this, but.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's in all these cases, there's a lot we don't want to believe, and I guess really what we're getting at, though, is it possible, and does it happen sometimes, and sometimes it does.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, I know we don't have a lot of time left. There's one thing that I really want to know is, with all this renewed interest in the case, and I would imagine maybe Boulder is starting to use some new techniques to maybe re-examine evidence and look at this case again. What can happen from this point on? Could there potentially be another grand jury? If you've already had a grand jury, could you have another one? Are there any statute of limitations? I know there's not in murder, but are there any other statutes that affect this case? And what could we expect moving forward legally?
I think it's fair to say that for any other crimes but murder, the statutes run. I haven't looked at every potential crime under the Colorado law, but murder doesn't have a statute of limitations. Burglary, that would have run by now if an intruder did this. But yes, they could have another grand jury. The indictment was never signed and filed. There's no prosecution, so they could impanel another grand jury. Maybe.
Beth, can I just ask you, just on that grand jury, do you think there wasn't enough? I mean, we know now in retrospect the contents of those indictments. Do you think that there wasn't enough evidence to proceed?
That's probably the case, at least according to Alex Hunter. Now, it's my experience that if you ask the grand jury to vote charges and they vote them, you file it. And you continue the investigation and you go to trial. And if you want to, I suppose you can dismiss it for trial, and then you could still bring it again, as long as you haven't gone to trial yet. It was odd to me that the grand jury voted charges and Alex Hunter refused to file it. The only thing I can think is that he didn't feel he could win the case, and that there was, a huge legal team with a lot of money that they were being paid, defending the Ramseys, and that it was going to be an uphill battle for him, and he didn't want to go down in flames and lose it, so he just didn't file it. But he should have asked.
OJ case just a year prior.
Yeah.
OJ Simpson case happened just 1 year earlier, and I think that that was terrifying.
Yeah, and Nick, you had an excellent point. And Nick and I talked a little bit before we talked to you, and Nick said, my impression of Alex Hunter is that he was always more concerned about how all of this looked for him, as opposed to getting justice for JonBenet. And I absolutely believe that.
in the federal system, right, our federal government, they don't do the murders that occur in states. They'll do murders that occur on federal property and then get jurisdiction different ways. But, we have our state laws and we have our federal law. In the federal system, I'm told by my friends who are federal prosecutors, they are not supposed to get a vote from the grand jury unless they believe the proof beyond a reasonable doubt, unless they have enough to go to trial. Don't even get that initial vote. That's not the case necessarily in states. You want to know you have a good case, but you often are continuing your investigation even after the indictment.
Yeah.
So, I do believe, though, that Alex Hunter didn't feel he had enough evidence.
Yeah. Yeah, well, and I think I agree that I think that he may have felt that, but I think he felt that from his own perspective. Do you know, looking at it through kind of a muddy picture there, not really was there enough, but enough for him personally. Do you know what I mean?
Right, and right.
Yeah.
I understand what you're saying, but sometimes you just have to take cases to trial.
Yeah.
Let the jury decide, and if you lose, you lose.
Yeah, absolutely.
Can I ask you what you thought? I mean, you were in that documentary. What were your personal feelings about the sexual assault side of things?
Well, it seems like there are conflicting opinions about whether or not there's evidence that she had been chronically abused, and maybe, that it was sexual abuse over time, not just this one time. I mean, there seems to be conflicting opinions. So I'm confused about that because I thought there was evidence that she had sexually abused. And now I'm not so sure. Over time.
In a narrative perspective, there were various times where Lisa and I were looking at various possibilities. And, if you look at the terms of the indictment are parents recklessly endangering their one child, and et cetera, et cetera. Now, if there was a sexual dimension to the danger that John Bonet was being exposed to, then it would show that if there was it could actually show that there was a sexual dimension prior to the crime even taking place. Do you know what I mean? That could be an aspect to the indictment. But it could be that the sexual aspect was implicit in the crime, but also running up to the crime. That's where the idea of the abuse.
That might have been a big motive behind voting the charges. If the evidence before the grand jury in 1999 was that this little girl had been abused over time. I mean, she's 6 years old. She's in the care of her parents. They must have known something, or they were reckless in their care of her to let her be in the company of people who were doing this to her. So, I'm sure that was the motivator, but I don't know really how strong that evidence is, because I know the experts differ now about that. By the way, I just want to mention that I covered a trial of a crime that occurred in 2002. The trial was later that year, of a little girl, year older than Jean Monnet, 7 years old, San Diego, who was kidnapped out of her bed, probably raped. She was too decomposed by the time she was found 3.5 weeks later, naked in the desert. But the intruder was, and he was probably waiting in the house when the family was out. He waited in the house. And so...
A 1-year-old child?
Pardon me?
A 1-year-old child?
No, she was a year older than Jean Monnet, 7.
Yeah. So, what's interesting is that and you see this, in all these cases, especially high profile cases of kids being taken, kidnapped, Elizabeth Smart, she ended up living, but they're all taken outside of the home. I mean, it's such an incredibly rare circumstance for what happened to Jean Bonet to happen to her and still be in that house. There's this argument about, they and Lou Smith felt that, this suitcase could have been something they were going to take her out, and because they couldn't get it out the window, that's why the body was left there. That makes no sense to me whatsoever. First of all, if you feel like you need some type of bag to get a body out of a house, you're going to bring it with you, right? You're going to be prepared.
You're going to bring a prepared note.
Absolutely, well, sure, absolutely.
Well,
And there were a million doors to go out. I mean, that intruder, if there had been an intruder, if that's what happened, was up and down those stairs and throughout that house. Why couldn't you have just simply gone out any of those doors? I don't see an argument that can be made for why it had to be that basement window and why it had to be like a suitcase. Like,
they looked at a lot of people. Every person they looked at where they had DNA was excluded by DNA.
Yeah.
So, there were individuals.
Yeah.
So, Beth, of the various, the spectrum of suspects, who would you say stood out to you?
So I'm looking down my notes. Probably Michael Helgoff. Not Santa Claus, not Gary Oliva, but Michael Helgoff, because he was boasting, and his friend Kennedy, John Kennedy, I think was his name, Keneady, was in that documentary.
Yeah.
He died by a gunshot wound a couple of months after Jean-Benet, but he had been telling this guy who's in the documentary that he and his buddy were coming into $50,000-$60,000 each, which is approximately half of the ransom note demand, right? $180,000, and that it was going to be soon, and this was around the holidays. Alex Hunter, a couple months after the murder, he goes public in a press conference saying that the list of suspects is getting shorter and shorter, and pretty soon we will know who you are. And soon after that, Helgoff is found shot. Now, he was right-handed, but he was found shot with the trajectory of the bullet going left to right. So he had to hold the gun in his left hand. He had high-tech boots. He had a baseball cap with SBTC on it. Let me see, he had a videotape of a news story about an unsolved kidnap and murder of a 6-year-old.
You said he wanted to know what it felt like to crack someone's skull as well.
I mean, I don't know. I mean, maybe it was a kidnapping gone bad. I don't know. And so there was a theory that his cohort is the one who killed him, so that he wouldn't talk.
Yeah. Our only problem with that is, if you've now got this accomplice, you've now got a second person who needs evidence of him left behind. And also, as soon as you have that argument, you're basically saying, okay, well, you've got two guys, and they've decided not to go through the butler entrance, which was open anyway, which was at the kitchen, which is where the ransom note was left. They're going to now go downstairs and then exit through the window. They wouldn't need the suitcase. They could just hand Jean-Benet to the accomplice, and
Yeah.
I first of all, I can never get over the ransom note, right? No handwriting expert can say Patsy's excluded. And Don Foster from Vassar, and like a medieval archivist or something, said she did write it. So I just can't get beyond that. The pen it was written with is from the house. It was in like little pencil holder.
Yeah.
The pad is from the house. There's a practice note they could see from impressions on the pad. I mean, I couldn't get past that. That's my problem.
I would have thought, like when we started researching this case, I would have thought Alex Hunter would have had enough just with the ransom note. You know what I mean? They would have enough. That was like exhibit A of far more than enough evidence. Just not even the handwriting, the fact that the notes, the papers in the house, the pens in the house, and then the fact that you can't exclude Patsy as the writer of it. Just something I want to quickly put on your radar, Beth. If you look at the role of the let's say someone is a murderer and they have a certain occupation. So let's say O.J. Simpson is an athlete, and he's someone who's very strong and athletic, and he can get from A to B very quickly. Same with Oscar Pistorius. You get Jodi Arias as well, who's full of her shenanigans. So let's take someone like John Ramsey. Now we looked at his job prior to this. He was a Navy engineer, but one of the things that he did was he was a site manager. Now, a site manager is someone who organizes access, he organizes security, he organizes who's where and what. And we were just thinking of that in terms of a crime scene. Someone who's who may be thinking, well, we need someone else's DNA in here. We need a certain flow. We need certain people here and there. Now, what's interesting is Linda Oren saying, well, it was odd. John and Patsy weren't talking to each other, but maybe they were manning entry points and exit points and sort of just subtly moving people around. And just a thought that came up just.
Think about that, the DA has said, you're exonerated, so go live your life.
Yeah. But that can be, that was at that time. I mean, certainly if there were to be some evidence that was compelling for somebody, now, I mean, that could be taken away. It's not like that's a forever thing. You're exonerated and we'll never look at you again, right?
Well, I don't know. I don't think they will ever look at them again, but I suppose it could be taken away. I think there'd be litigation. I'm not sure.
Interesting.
I don't think Ramsey's will, unless there were a DNA hit, and that's not going to happen.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
I just want to touch on two things you mentioned in a documentary that were quite interesting, but you could also flip around. The one related to Bill McReynolds, the Santa Claus, another one related to Helgoth's suicide. So, what's interesting, we can actually see video where Patsy is giving Bill McReynolds a hug at John Bonet's funeral. Mm-hmm. And I think you say in the documentary that, if Bill McReynolds was guilty, then he would have sort of pushed Patsy away, just feeling a bit awkward.
Somebody told the police to take a look at that video because when she goes to hug him, he pulls her away. Mm-hmm. But he's like, and that meaning, look, something's up with this guy. If he can't hug her, he's responsible for it. Ultimately, they did rule him out. His DNA didn't match. He's a little bit eccentric, retired journalism professor. And John Bonet was told something special. Santa was going to pay a special visit or something after Christmas. Well, that's why a lot of people are thinking that it was McReynolds.
Yeah.
Why flip that whole thing around and say, well, maybe Bill McReynolds felt awkward. Maybe he felt, well, Patsy, I'm not sure if I want to hug you. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So it could be.
I don't know. I don't know why he wouldn't want to, but I don't know.
It's really interesting when Lou Smith asks John Ramsey, who's your number one suspect? Who sticks out from everybody? His answer without missing a beat was Bill McReynolds. Now, you'd think, wow, here it is. And then it turns out this guy's had, open heart surgery and he's 62 years old. And you're thinking, this guy was running around in a house with people and he's this sadistic pedophile, this monster, this guy.
Right.
And this is John Ramsey's pick of the bunch. Not Helgoth, this guy. It's kind of,
Right, and they were thoroughly investigated. I mean, all these people, it's so strange that there were so many potential people who had some little quirk or two, in their past that could have connected them, a pedophile, like a homeless pedophile who was staying at a church nearby, Gary Oliva, and John Martin synthesis in the mid-2000s. I mean, it was all so strange. But ultimately, the Boulder police never could rule out the Ramseys or someone in that house, and they couldn't rule. They couldn't figure out whether or not Patsy wrote that note. Some believe she did.
But they also could never connect any intruder to what happened. I mean, they all those investigators said there was far more evidence of there not being an intruder than there was. Yeah.
Right. So I don't know that this case will ever be solved. Some people feel that someday the DNA technology will be such that I don't know.
Yeah.
Okay, so I just want to touch on Helgoth. This idea that he was shot by his accomplice. Is this imaginative to say, well, I can kind of imagine, if you decided you want to take yourself out, that you would use a pillow because you don't want to see you don't want to see or hear the blow. I mean, you know what I mean?
I don't think that's unusual to use a pillow. And he was a military sharpshooter, so maybe he was ambidextrous when it came to firing a gun. But he was shot on the left side. So what did he do? He used the pillow and his left hand?
Mm.
It's
Yes.
a bit unusual.
Interesting.
Okay.
All right.
So last question, Beth. There's litigation going on with certain people, and then there's also the threat of litigation against CBS, which one assumes will happen. So isn't that a possible way that this case could actually come back to life? Is if CBS...
mentioned that to somebody who was in the CBS show. I saw him in LA a couple weeks ago, and I said, "Before you get sued," I said, "go to trial, because truth is a defense, and we'll finally have a trial. And, you put out why you think what you think, and we'll get it litigated in a court of law." CBS
that's one way to bring the case to trial, is to that way.
It would be through a defamation suit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What are the chances of
we've
that? I
actually
mean, do you
had
think
that
that would happen, or do you think that this is just something that's going to be settled?
I think, if the lawsuit's filed, I think it'll settle.
Yeah.
But lawsuits are expensive. I mean, if CBS wanted to spend millions of dollars litigating it so that we'd all get the benefit of a trial, they can get rid of it for less than that. They should.
Yeah.
Beth, how about this? If CBS communicates that they've now been sued and it's all official and so on, CBS can say, okay, we the bad guys maybe, but I think there are a lot of people out there. There's the public out there, and what would you like us to do? Would you like us to fight this? And if you do you wanna support us? Should we have a public fund where those who want to be involved will, and I think there could be something to that.
Yeah, Nick, I don't think they would do it, but nice idea, good idea. I'd make it worthwhile, but I don't think they'll want to just spend the resources, the man hours and all that.
Yeah.
But you never know.
We might want to start a crowdfunder account ourselves.
Ben, it's been great talking to you as always. Lots of great insights.
Great to talk to you too.
Are you going to be on another documentary soon?
Talks about. I am on one that's on Reels, REELZ, the network. It's a series about Hollywood homicides, and I'm in the Phil Spector one. I think that first aired a couple weeks ago, but that's out there. It gets repeated, so it's on Phil Spector. But there are documentaries that are coming up on old cases, kind of the classic cases that I worked on. And so I haven't been interviewed yet, but possibly on Scott Peterson and Casey Anthony, Jody Arias.
Good. Okay, we'll be watching. Cool. Thanks for your time.
Thanks,
I really appreciate it.
Sure. My pleasure.
All right.
Have a